So now that we have our VApp configured, we can actually start to go through each of the firewalls and configure them for VRRP. The configuration doesn't take too many steps, which is nice, and it's basically a duplicate from one firewall to the second, so we don't need to adjust for too many changes. I'm going to jump onto the Windows 10 host and start configuring the first firewall through SSH. Then we can go back and make the same changes on that second firewall here as well. So from our Windows 10 host, I'm going to SSH into our 1.1 IP address, which was the firewall 01, and log in with my account. Okay, and there's not really too much that we actually need to change, and most all of it happens at the actual interface configuration. Now, if we think about what we're doing with VRRP, we're trying to get our internal hosts to talk to a virtual IP address that's on that same LAN or that same subnet. So when I do a show configure, what we can see here is when we go down a little bit, we're going to be dealing primarily with this gig001 interface. So jumping down to that interface level, we'll start that VRRP configuration. So I'm going to get into configure mode. And once we're in there, we're going to drop all the way down into the virtual interfaces section. So I will do edit interfaces, GE001, unit 0, family INET. Okay, if I want 192.168.1.1 to be the virtual IP address for all of the routers participating in VRRP, I can't have it set as the physical interface IP address here. What I'm going to do first is delete the 192.168.1.1 IP address. So we'll need to do actually a delete address, fix that. Okay, so if we do a show, we can see that there's no addresses set. And what we'll do is we'll change that to be a set address of 192.168.1.2/24. So we're just going to increment it by 1 from what we want it to be. So 1.1 will be our virtual IP address. 1.2 will be the IP address we can use for this router if we need to get into it for management or anything like that. Perfect. Once we have the new IP address set, we're actually going to go into the address and we can start to configure the virtual addresses and the VRRP group. So I'm going to just save us a little bit of typing and go into edit address 192.168.1.2/24 so we don't have to type that out every single time. And we can start to make the VRRP changes. So we'll do a set VRRP group and we can just pick a number for this. I'm going to go with group 1 and set up the virtual address of 192.168.1.1. Now when I configure all of my endpoints, they should point to 192.168.1.1 for their gateway. So we've got the virtual address set. The next thing that I want to do is set the priority of this router. And remember, we have this value between 1 and 255, and the higher the priority number, the more likely that this router is going to be the master router. So we'll do a set VRRP group. We're still working in group 1, priority. And we can see actually it's 0 through 255. I think I said 1 through 255. But we're going to set this priority up to be 200, and we can keep moving on. Next thing I want to do is set the authentication. So it's probably a good idea if we're going to use VRRP to make sure that we at least have some sort of passphrase so somebody can't add a router into our network and then start to simulate our default gateway as a higher priority router. We can end up with some man-in-the-middle type attacks or denial of service as a result of that. So we're at least going to set up some sort of password for it. So we'll do set authentication. So set VRRP group 1 authentication type. We've got two types. You can do basically a simple or clear text password, or we can do MD5 on it. And we'll set the VRRP group 1. And we can use the authentication key, and we can just make up anything for that. So something like password 1bang would work for that. Now the last thing that I need to do, or one of the last two things I need to do, is allow this router to accept traffic coming into 192.168.1.1. So it's a simple command. We'll set VRRP group 1, and we set it to accept data. Basically, it says if you see any packets marked for 192.168.1.1 and you're the master router, go ahead and process that traffic and ship it off as it needs to be. The very last thing I need to do is tell it if there's any conditions that are going to make this router be an invalid candidate for the master, we want to lower its priority. So an example of this would be if my internet connection, that WAN connection, is on the physical interface gig Ethernet 000. If that interface were to go down on this firewall, it's not going to be a suitable candidate for our gateway. Right? If there's no way out of this network and our clients are using this as the gateway, there's going to be nowhere for them to go. So we kind of can set up these events for when the backup router should take over for this current master router. So the event I'm going to use is we'll do a set VRRP group 1. We're going to do what's called tracking an interface. So basically this will just monitor for an interface to go down. In our case it was, let's see, we had GE 000. We'll set the priority cost of 200. Basically it says we'll decrement our priority by 200. Pardon me. Okay, so on to our next firewall here. Let's do a commit check. Everything looks good, so we'll do a commit comment. We'll say added VRRP config. Okay, so when we do this, right, we just changed the IP address of our inside interface here. So we're going to eventually lose this connection to our firewall, so let's just close out of this. And we can get back in with the new IP address here. So the new IP that we just set was 1.2, and it should allow us in. And everything looks good. Now I'm going to SSH to our second firewall here, so that was 138.247.98.50. See if this connection still works, and it looks good. And we can kind of walk through this configuration again here on the second firewall. I'm going to do a show configuration and see what we need to change here. So one of the first things that I see that we need to change, sort of like we did with that first firewall, is change the physical address on gig Ethernet 001. We will set up the VRRP virtual IP, the authentication and everything just like we did, so they have to match what we did on that first firewall. Beyond that, I believe this firewall doesn't have anything in the security zones, so we'll want to change that trust zone here a little bit. Right, so if we check that security zone trust, our gig Ethernet 001 isn't in there. So the problem we would have is if our master firewall failed, and this firewall that we're on took over as backup, it wouldn't allow any traffic from our hosts to get out of the network here since we're not having any inbound traffic allowed. So a couple changes for this one, but shouldn't be anything too bad. Let's jump right into configure mode, and we can start out with that gig Ethernet 001 interface. So go into edit interfaces, GE 001, unit 0, and then family, inet, and we'll start here. So let's do a show, and let's do a delete address 10.0.0.1 /24 and do a show again just to make sure that's gone. So it looks good. We'll add a new address to this. So we'll do set address 192.168. We can use 1.3, and we'll call that a /24 as well. Right, so again, the big idea here is that the address we set has to be in the same subnet as our virtual IP address, and it can't be the same as virtual IP. So again, I'm going to go into edit address 192.168.1.3 /24 to save ourselves a little bit of typing. And we can even take it a step further than we did in that last firewall. And we can just go into our VRRP group. 1, and then we can go set all those parameters that we need to in there. So walking through those same things, we'll do a set address, or set virtual address of 192.168.1.1. We'll do a set priority, and if I want this to be the backup router, I can set it to a lower value than 200, which we used on that first router. So this will be a less likely router to become the master. We'll set up our authentication type. So we need set authentication type, MD5. We'll do a set authentication key of same thing that we had on that first router. So password1 exclamation point. Perfect. So getting down there, a couple things we need to do again is we need to set accept data, right? Because if we're going to have this router be failed over to, it needs to take in client traffic on 192.168.1.1. And lastly, we'll set up an event for if this router has a failure, how should we know that it's no longer a suitable candidate? We're going to do the same thing here and say set track. We're going to watch the Gig Ethernet 000 interface. So that would be, again, the WAN interface. So we need set track interface. And we'll subtract our priority by 100. So basically we're going to move this to a 0 priority if we see that that interface goes down, and this should not be a backup router anymore. All right, perfect. Let's do a commit check and see if our VRRP config passes. Everything looks good, so I'm going to do a commit comment. And I'll say, again, added VRRP config. And everything looks good. Last thing I needed to do is modify the trust security zone to allow traffic coming in from Gig Ethernet 001 to be entering into the firewall. So we'll go into Edit Security Zones, Security Zone Trust, Interfaces, and this was Gig Ethernet 001. .0. So we can do a set host inbound traffic to say what kind of stuff are we going to allow inbound. And we'll pick from our system services, and for now we can just allow all system service to be coming into this firewall. We'll do one more commit check. Everything looks good, so we'll do a commit comment and say modified trust zone. Perfect. So we should be good now. So I'm going to actually exit out of this here, and we can check a couple of things. So I'm going to get out of firewall 2, and I'm just sitting at firewall 1 here. I'm going to make a new session and make sure that I can actually get into our second firewall. So the IP address we just assigned to it should be 192.168.1.3. That's on our internal side of things. So that's looking good. And let's take a look at our show VRRP. When you do show VRRP, there's a few different things we can do with it. I can maximize this, try to make this look a little bit better. So you can get obviously various levels of detail of how much information you want about VRRP. But just to start out, if you just do the default show VRRP, what we're looking for is that it's in an up state. We should have a master and a backup, and that we're in the active mode. You can see the real interfaces address as well as the virtual IP address. Now I want to show you this because we're going to have one problem with the vSphere environment that we're currently in. So if I do a show VRRP on the first firewall, what you see, and it's kind of a little bit difficult, maybe if we do something like this. So let's do a show VRRP again. We have a master here in firewall 1. And on firewall 2, if I do show VRRP, we have a master here as well. So we should never have two masters. That's usually a good indicator that something is going wrong. Now, if you do a request VRRP, or excuse me, restart VRRP gracefully, this will restart the actual VRRP process. And now we can see it's in a backup state. Now this doesn't last very long because the hello packets being exchanged between these routers happen every second. Now when we create these virtual IP addresses, there's also a virtual MAC address that gets created as well. The problem that I'm currently running into is that the virtual switch set up in the vCloud environment specifically blocks packets that look like they're spoofed or coming from an illegitimate MAC or IP address. So even though we're using this legitimate VRRP protocol, vSphere is blocking it, saying this looks like someone's spoofing an address and it shouldn't be going across the network. I'm going to see if I can get that turned off for our networks, but I just wanted to show you at least this is how the configuration works. Here's a couple of things that we can check or you might run into, but in a normal switched environment, we would see that firewall 01 set up as the master, and this firewall 02 here set up as the backup. So again, I'll take a look at that and see if we can get the security protections for the spoofing turned off, and we can go from there.